Hello and welcome to episode 165 of the Clean Energy Show. I'm Brian Stockton.
And I'm James Whittingham. This week, the Canadian Federal Minister for Industry explains why a clean power grid is important for business. He did so in a newspaper column in the Star Phoenix. We wouldn't have needed him to do that if everyone listened to this show, Brian. Think of the trees we could have saved if everyone just listened to our show.
So many trees. ChargeX is a new consortium that aims to improve EV charging reliability in the U.S. How about a consortium to clean the restrooms and provide better snacks?
Ukrainian businesses and institutions are using renewable energy to cope with the attacks by Russia on their power grid. Renewables are so cheap, the Ukrainians say Russia won't waste their expensive missiles on them. Fact is, Brian, Putin prefers large civilian apartment buildings as targets because it looks better on TV.
The Biden administration has asked the Energy Department to find climate-friendly alternatives for jet and shipping fuels. He then put on his shades and peeled away in his jet-fueled Corvette.
All that and more on this exciting edition of the Clean Energy Show. Also coming up with this week's show, Brian, a upcoming Martin Scorsese film will remind us how evil the oil industry is. Even 100 years ago, it just debuted at Cannes. Brian, you're going to update us on your cold weather heat pump installation and how 2- and 3-wheel electric vehicles are displacing huge amounts of oil in many parts of the world already. It's not cars, it's everything is electrified and everything's going to kick oil's ass. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. So yes, the heat pump update is first. And if you're watching on video, my background is different today because I've been kicked out of my bomb shelter studio because the installation is going on today. And it's going on partly in my bomb shelter where I record the show. So the recap from last week, they started to drill through the wall, which is like a room in my basement, which happens to be a fallout shelter built in 1962. But Kyle couldn't get all the way through, so he came back today with a new 3-foot drill bit. He'd had 2 of them, in fact, like a smaller one and a bigger one, to get through the cement foundation, and then there's cindercrete blocks as well, because it's a fallout shelter, and so he was able to drill through today. He said he might still need a torch for something, but I didn't quite understand what that was for, but...
That's for you. I don't know.
But... I found out something else about my bomb shelter. The cindercrete blocks are all filled with sand, which he figured out once he started drilling through. A whole bunch of sand came out. So they put in cindercrete blocks and filled them all with sand, which, I think that makes sense for a fallout shelter.
It makes total sense. That is hilarious. Of course, your bomb shelter would be filled with sand in the middle of the cindercrete blocks, which have, voids in them.
So I told him we're recording the podcast and we're doing it up here. So he promised to keep a little bit quiet for the next hour or so in case he has to do any more drilling or whatever. But so we're getting close. Might be finished by next week.
Interesting. Do you want to name the company in case there's some people here where we live that want to know where you found a cold? Because you had to do some digging to find somebody to do this.
Yeah, it's called Advance Energy, and they're also working with Iceman Electrical, which is Kyle, who's here today. And it's hard to find an air source heat pump. It's not a normal thing to do around here. It may be a terrible mistake. I know it's expensive. I won't really find out until the winter how well it's going to work. I mean, my only concern really, because it has a backup resistive heater. So below minus 22 Celsius, the backup resistive heater kicks in. So I'm sure it'll work. The only concern is how high the electrical bills will be. And, but manageable, hopefully, once I eliminate some of my natural gas bill.
Now, most heat pumps we hear about going down to 25 or 30 Celsius. Does yours not do that? Or is it just...
minus 22 is the number on the spec sheet.
Okay. The U.S. government had funds to give out grants for people who improved that spec. I think they may have. A couple of companies, because we mentioned it on the show before, may have improved that spec. So in the future, I mean, you're the guinea pig. You're the early adopter guinea pig. And if you freeze to death, you're a popsicle. But yeah, resistive heating, that's going to be interesting. Do you know any specs about the resistive heater? The resistive heater is just like a toaster. It's like two wires that get hot. It's not terribly efficient. I mean, it is efficient, but it's 100% efficient, I guess, but it's not. A heat pump can be several times efficient.
I can report back on that once I know, but I think it'll be a few thousand watts. So, once we drop down to minus 22, it'll be probably using a few thousand watts of power. So, potentially a lot of energy. But this is such an interesting problem because, I put my solar panels on 5-6 years ago, and as soon as I did that, we got net zero for our electrical bill. We were generating as much as we were using. It was fantastic. Then we got the electric car and suddenly we weren't quite net zero anymore. But as soon as I put those solar panels on, that was the first thing I thought about was how to get rid of my natural gas furnace. This is something I wanted to do since then. And I thought it's got to be possible somehow. And of course, the solution at that time, the main solution would have been a ground source heat pump, but those are so expensive. They're very difficult to install, especially in a city property. They're more for rural properties. But I always thought back then, it's like, well, air source heat pumps exist. Surely this will be a thing that we can do in the future that is simpler for everybody. And yes, it's not as efficient. You definitely need more power to run them. But, we're looking towards a future where we'll have lots of power on the grid. We'll have lots of clean power. Now, it's not happening right away, and we're talking about the problems we have here locally. They're trying to delay this switch as long as possible. We have a very dirty grid here. But, in several years, this is not going to be an issue. And even insulating our homes, you have a super insulated home, and that's fantastic. But in the future, when, clean energy is fairly cheap and abundant, that stuff is going to become less important, I think.
You think 50 years from now, we won't even insulate our homes? We'll just use all the free energy there is out there.
It's possible. There's still a benefit in terms of the comfort level of your house, I think, to have them insulated to a certain level. But, this is a thing we'll have to think about. We're still planning to build a new cottage out at our cottage property. And the idea was to do something super efficient, but I don't know, that might be too expensive. So we might end up with just like more solar panels and maybe more batteries and just use more power rather than build a more expensive building.
They should let you do a solar array on the lake floating, just the width of your property out a few hundred yards or something. Okay, well, that's interesting. And we'll keep in touch with you adventurer in this because I'll remind new listeners to the show that we live in Canada and it gets very colder here than it does in most places in Canada. We plug in our gas vehicles so that it'll start in the wintertime. They have little heaters in the oil pan to heat the oil so that it is liquid and not solid. But it's also warm in the summer here too. And summer is kind of here, but it's kind of not. I mean, there's these forest fire smoke in mostly northern Alberta, actually kind of around the oil sands and towards the Rocky Mountains from there. We're getting all the smoke. I know you guys in the States are getting a lot of our smoke. We apologize for that. My kid, the university student, he went to Edmonton on the weekend. We had a long weekend here to celebrate Queen Victoria's birthday, because why wouldn't you? I mean, of course, she's very near and dear to all of us here in Canada. You went on vacation too, but my kid who has asthma went to the Edmonton, which was, they have this chart. We had one really bad day in my whole life, and it's been a long one. I've never had that bad of air. Like, it was just choking. And they have a 1 to 10 air quality chart. This was way off the charts. And when my kid went to Edmonton, the whole time he was there, it was all way off the charts. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't do anything. But how was your trip? You went on a bit of a vacation.
Right. So I was in Alberta as well. I went to Calgary for a few days. And Calgary and Edmonton were both really, really bad for forest fire smoke. I know there was some here, but I think it was worse there. The weird thing is, so the recommendation now when the smoke is that bad is to wear a mask, like the N95 masks that we were all wearing throughout the pandemic. But it makes sense, right? If you don't want to breathe in all the particulate matter that's in the air. So we found ourselves in the weird position of wearing our N95 masks when we were outside and then taking them off when we went inside, like to a shopping mall.
Wow.
Because, no one else is wearing masks. It seems weird to wear masks. And so it was a weird flip that's happened. But I think it does help. There was a story on Bloomberg this week about the forest fires in Australia a few years ago. And hello to our Australian listeners. I feel like we've been neglecting the Australian news lately.
But you're still there for us. I see you. We're charting in Australia all the time. Thank you for listening. Even if you don't contact the show, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com.
Yeah.
Just say hi.
But anyway, a very big story on Bloomberg this week about the effects of that from 3 years ago. And there's a lot of lingering health effects from people who breathed in a lot of that smoke over time. And this is toxic smoke. It's a bit like smoking cigarettes. In fact, there was a quote in the article that, let me see if I can find it here. It's I don't know, being outside for an hour is like smoking like 37 cigarettes or something like that.
Well, I know we had a bad day. I can't remember what day it was. What day did you leave? Thursday?
Yeah.
You might have missed the bad day here.
Yeah, I think.
Because we had a really bad day, and I've never seen anything like it. It's just choking.
Yeah.
You couldn't get away from it.
So we're looking forward to having the heat pump installed, because then when it's smoky out and hot, we can put the air conditioning on, we can keep the windows closed and, breathe slightly cleaner air because of it.
I really like the windows open, though. So I'm kind of pissed off. It's summer, it's that time of year. Yeah. It hasn't been so hot that I had to turn on the air conditioner, but it was, I expect my fresh air. I'm getting it right now.
Yeah. And of course, our routine was to keep the windows closed during the day when it's hot, to keep the hot air out, and then you open them at night to cool the house off. But of course, then you're letting in all the smoke if it's smoky out.
So you and I both have solar panels on our roofs, and I don't have the data for mine, but it's been sunny days without the sun for, I don't know, a week now or longer.
Yeah.
And
we're getting ripped off from solar power because of the smoke.
From climate change. So it's a feedback loop. We're not getting our of course, it's a feedback loop. I don't know, does it act as a blanket or does it actually reflect some of it? I don't know. But I do know that we were supposed to be very warm today and we're not. So that's where we're at. I don't know. I'm just sick of the smoke. I'm sick of my pool's not open. I went in it once to open it up. One day to put the pancake or the wedding cake style stairs in, and had to go underwater and put sandbags underneath to keep it down. And then I vacuumed it, and then I haven't been in since. So I'm running it. I have to run it so the mosquitoes don't breed and so the algae doesn't form. But it's been, because it's solar heated, I haven't been able to get in. It's thermo solar panels I'm using on that. It's doing pretty well, but the smoke is preventing that for me, so I'm kind of mad. It was June last year because of a freaky spring that I couldn't get in. It's going to be that again this year. Brian, I wanted to mention just before, we are a day late and we apologize, but it was a long weekend for, blame Queen Victoria for it. Otherwise, Brian would have been in town. We're a day late this week, and I was, it's Wednesday at lunchtime, and there was a call-in radio show on CBC, as they often do, and I kind of cringe whenever they do it because I know that the caller is on EVs because it's about EVs. Every once in a while, they have an EV show, and a fella from our EV community, Tyler Krause, which I think he's a rock star, and I'll explain why. You didn't hear this, right? I'm going to tell you a story that's going to blow your mind. He was the perfect person to have there during a disinformation caller, which I have. This is what I haven't heard before. I've heard them all. Here's a new one.
I'm not sure if this is fact or fiction, so maybe somebody there can clarify this for me. There's been a lot of talk about the word infrastructure and getting EVs on the road. And I have a question about getting EVs in high structure parkades and the weight of them. And I guess, is that an issue that eventually, if we get so many in there and parkades are only made for a certain amount of weight, that might be an actual literal infrastructure issue?
Wrong.
No, and I just want to add a translation there. Parkade is a Canadian term for a parking garage.
Yeah, there you go. I would have missed that completely. 80% of our audience wouldn't have gotten that. But Tyler, God bless him. He's a structural engineer. I knew he was an engineer. I didn't know he was a structural engineer. So he could debunk that crap left and right, swat it out of the air. And, there's a lot of things to do with weight. Like I mentioned on the show, there was a national newspaper article in Canada about, an opinion piece about heavy EVs hitting pedestrians. Like that's going to make a freaking difference. Getting hit by a car is pretty bad. It doesn't matter if it's a bit heavier. Run over may be a different story, but man. Like I said, I couldn't listen to it, but I had to listen to it and grab a clip for the show.
Yeah. No, I gave up listening to call-in shows many, many years ago. But also quick charging story, which sort of relates to all this. One of the big things that people mention when you have an EV is that they'll say, oh, well, what do you do if the power goes out? You can't charge the car if the power goes out. And that happened to me.
Really?
We were in Maple Creek and we were going to charge at the Tesla supercharger, and we tried to plug in and nothing was happening. We didn't know what was going on. It wouldn't start charging. And then someone drove by in a car and said, oh, the power's out for the whole town. It's about 9 a.m. and they said, yeah, they think it'll be back up around noon. So, of course, the answer in terms of is that bad for EVs, of course, there's a gas station right there and you can't pump gas without electricity either. But,
the EV chargers you speak of, as most of them are around here, are actually at gas stations. So they're shut down.
Yeah. Now, I think in the future, there'll be battery backup often for these kinds of charging stations. Like Tesla can put a mega pack at them. I think they're going to start doing that. So maybe someday that power outages won't matter so much. But it was a huge one. Like it had already been out for about 12 hours at the time we rolled up. Yeah, the power was still on in Cypress Hills where we stayed overnight.
It's not thunderstorm season, and there was no storm.
No.
What the hell?
I don't know what the problem was, but anyway, luckily we had enough charge to make it to Medicine Hat. It was only another hour, and we had sort of overcharged the previous thing, so we had enough to make it. We made it there with like 10 or 15% of the battery.
That's plenty.
And just want to mention the charging in Calgary quickly. There's only one. They're building another one, and it's kind of on the outskirts. It's at a shopping mall, and they've got 8 chargers, but they're the version 2, so they're only 150 kilowatts. But if the chargers are full, you're split in half, so it's 75 kilowatts. So I went on Saturday morning of the long weekend, and I actually had to wait for about 5 minutes. The chargers were full, but I wanted to mention it because it shows you how important speed is, right? Like when they're building this new charging infrastructure for EVs, it's important to build the fastest ones possible, because the faster the chargers, the faster you get people out of there.
Yeah, but less chargers you have to build. If the charge is fast.
And they just turn over quicker. So, they just weren't turning over that quick because everybody was only getting 75 kilowatts. That was the max that you could get. So, I only had to wait about 5 minutes, but it's an important part of this. And like some of these chargers that they're putting in are only 50 kilowatts, some of the competition chargers. So I don't know, faster is better. You need fewer of them.
A couple of the other things I wanted to mention. It's been 4 years since the first Starlink rocket mission to deploy the Starlinks, and you have Starlink at the lake now.
I've got a Starlink dish out at the lake for our internet.
And they've got a new mobile one. Did you see that? That's kind of a flat thing you put on the roof of your pickup truck or whatever.
Yeah.
We could have our own Clean Energy Show satellite truck, Brian. Think about it. Just a camera and that satellite dish. We go around and do satellite interviews.
Yeah. No, and cruise lines are getting them, and airplanes and stuff. It's interesting.
So it's hard to believe it's been 4 years. And remember, a long time ago on the show, for long-time listeners, we talked about a geothermal electricity generating plant being tested in very South Saskatchewan. I do not have an update on that, other than to say we haven't heard anything from them in a long time. And it's now coming up on 5 years. It'll be 5 years in the fall that was drilling had started, and they were issuing press releases, and they anticipated supplying electricity to the grid in 2.5 years from then, I think. So it's 2 years overdue. And the thing is, we haven't heard anything, and there's just not enough journalists around here to ask questions. And, these things just get hidden, even though, it's possible the thing's not viable. It's entirely possible it's not viable.
Yeah, it always seemed like a good idea, but if they had just gone with like solar, wind, and batteries, it would be up and running by now.
Yeah, and you don't know, though. You don't know if that, I was thinking it's like as long as nuclear. It's longer because it's going to be longer than nuclear pretty soon. But you do have to test to see if the water supply you're tapping into works, and that takes years to do. Oh, it's time for
Ryan's Movie Corner.
Okay, it's James' Movie Corner this week. I just wanted to mention that Killers of the Flower Moon, an epic Western crime drama that's a true story by legendary American director Martin Scorsese, premiered at Cannes to a large standing ovation. Sometimes those are manufactured.
Yeah.
But the minutes-long standing ovation.
The Rotten Tomatoes rating is very high, so it does sound like it's decent.
Yeah, and it's 3.5 hours. So it's going to be another sort of Irishman type of film experience. Yeah. But it's full of, star-studded cast. It's out at the end of the year, probably. I think it's theaters in October, and it'll be on Apple TV Plus, which means I'll have to subscribe to that. It is based on the Osage Indian murders, which they call them on Wikipedia, were a series of murders of Osage Native Americans in Osage County, Oklahoma, during the 1910s to the 1930s. And newspapers described the increasing number of unsolved murders as a reign of terror. So what happened is First Nations people had oil on their land, and oil became a thing, a valuable thing. And they had the rights to it until they were murdered. They became wealthy, then they were murdered, and then the oil companies or other people stole the rights from it. So it's a true story. It is a story of evil in the oil industry 100 years ago. They're evil now. With their disinformation that EVs are going to crash garages. You don't want to be in one, in a parking garage. Some of the murders were committed for the purposes of taking over land and wealth of the Osage members whose land was producing valuable oil, and each had head rights that earned lucrative annual royalties. So I'm looking forward to that film. I would be anyway, but it's kind of tied into some of the things we talk about. Yeah,
I was skeptical hearing about it because I didn't really care for The Irishman that much, and Martin Scorsese is getting very old, and I was skeptical of him taking on a story of the indigenous people, but it sounds like he might have pulled it off. It's been getting very good reviews.
My brother-in-law didn't like The Irishman. We discussed it when he was in town a few weeks ago. I liked it, but I'm not a hater like some people who hate everything.
Okay, so there is an EV charger consortium that is coming together in the United States. So it's called ChargeX, and it was announced by the U.S. Department of Energy. It's a consortium made up of 30 companies, including players like Tesla, Electrify America, ChargePoint, General Motors, Ford, Tritium. And the idea is to actually implement some of the standards that were mentioned in the Inflation Reduction Act. So Biden decided to put a lot of money into the charging infrastructure for EVs, but included a clause basically that, they actually have to work. This is the clause.
Yeah.
And, there's been a problem. The Tesla chargers, as we've said before, very reliable, except when the power's out. But the third-party chargers, Electrify America, the other networks, they have not been particularly reliable. There's confusing apps that you have to use. So if you're getting government money, you've got to have decent reliability. And so that's what this consortium is planning to do, to sort of enforce those kind of standards and get everybody talking and get them working properly.
Yeah. So they're getting together, the different players in the charging sphere, and coming up with ideas and goals, I guess, to have the charging experience better. Maybe a large battery in, what was it, Maple Creek, Saskatchewan that you were in? That there was the power was out? Come on, people. That would be terrific. You remember we were talking about Gogoro's scooters, the ones with the little bread box size replaceable batteries, and many parts of the world having those charging stations operate for 2.5 days. So they've got that covered, but there's a lot of power outages in that part of the world. We're not supposed to deal with them so much here, but I guess in rural areas where you're charging your EV, who knows?
Yeah. No, and a few weeks ago, we talked about Prince Edward Island in Canada, who's going to do that with electric school buses. They're going to drive the school buses to their emergency shelters when the power's out and run them off of the school buses.
The network is starting to expand, but it has to work. And a lot of these places are down. I'm a little disappointed in that the new chargers they're putting in are only 100 kilowatt because a lot of cars can charge faster than that. What does your Tesla Model 3 charge at?
Yeah, mine maxes at 175 kilowatts, and I hit that twice on this trip, which was great. It doesn't always go that high. The battery, the temperature's got to be right. You've got to be down around 20% capacity. But yeah, I hit that twice, the 175 kilowatts. But most Teslas now are 250 watt maximum.
Yeah, kilowatt maximum. So that charges a lot faster than highway. The Hyundai, Kia cars are charging very fast, 18 minutes from 10 to 80%. So yeah, but if I'd be disappointed, but as a Chevy Bolt owner, it doesn't matter because my stupid car only does 50 kilowatts, 55. Yeah. So it wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. But I would really like to see chargers be modern, not just good enough to, that's on Sask Power, our utility. They should have done a better job with that. We need, I would say 200 would be nice, 200 kilowatts, 250, 300, but they should be future-proof because things are getting better. I mean, I don't know how often they go through the hardware, but yeah, it's been a huge problem for people. In fact, I think not in exactly Maple Creek, but near there in Swift Current, I remember a person going through there on Facebook, and none of the 3 or 4 different chargers, third-party chargers, worked. They're all broken or offline or not accepting the credit card or one thing or another. And they had to stay in a hotel. Like that can't be. Yeah, that's got to end now. So there's a big movement now, a big backlash against EVs not working. Last week on the show, Brian, we talked about our local government sort of poo-pooing climate change and not doing anything, whereas our neighboring province is sort of more of a free market. And because it's a free market and because renewables are cheap, they're going crazy with the renewables over there. And they'll be a lot more carbon friendly. Now, on this show, I have numerous times said that if you want to attract business, you have to have a clean grid because any company, any major or medium-sized company has to be accountable for their carbon emissions. That's in their statements, it's in their public records, and investors and users of that company want to know what their emissions are and how green are they. Well, if you set up shop here where you and I are and the grid is dirty as hell, then that's no good for it. And this is the federal minister of industry wrote an op-ed in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix a few days ago. He's Minister of Natural Resources, and he is actually from here, so he knows a bit about this place. He said that it's stupid not to aspire to a net zero grid by 2035, like the rest of the freaking free world and beyond. So this is what he says. Increasingly an economic matter, is being able to provide clean power to the industry is increasingly the price of entry in the marketing of products international. Having a grid with abundant clean power is and will be a significant comparative advantage in the global economy. So they have a slogan, our government, Saskatchewan Advantage. Well, it's a disadvantage because you're not going to be as competitive when you do that, or you're going to have to spend more money.
Amazon would be one example. Amazon's not going to set up any warehouses unless they can get clean power, and it'd be difficult to do that around here.
And he says firms looking to export products such as critical minerals, hydrogen, biofuels, potash, steel, and aluminum, all stuff that we can provide, are increasingly being held to account regarding the carbon content of their products. We have a lot of mining here, including the BHP Group. And as Saskatchewanians know, he says BHP is building the 7.5 billion Jansen potash mine. Potash is used in agriculture as a fertilizer. Anything else it's used for?
No, it's always been a bit of a mystery, but yeah, fertilizer.
A recent announcement from BHP regarding this project underlined the importance of emissions. The first sentence in the press release, he points out, touts the world-leading low-emissions potash mine that they're building. The second sentence claims the mine will generate the lowest direct emissions of any potash mine in the world. So if a potash mine is touting, is one of our biggest industries, is touting clean, they're going to have to build their own clean electricity to power the thing, and that's not going to make them less competitive. So we need to account for the carbon embedded in its products, and that's what this mine is doing, including the carbon content of the electricity it takes from the grid. And Saskatchewan government complains that electricity will get too expensive for others if we all put solar panels on our roofs. I hate them for that. That's just so ignorant. But you know what? If they stop paying retail tariffs, it's going to happen anyway. Panels are getting cheaper. Batteries are getting cheaper. I can't wait to get a battery so I don't have to give them any of my electricity. I'll use it all myself. So in a few years, there's a lot of people who are going to be using solar panels, and their argument, they can't stop people from doing it. They can not subsidize it, but or give a good tariff for it. But everybody's going to do it, and it is going to cost money for everybody else, because you and I and half the people who listen to the show are going to eventually have solar panels on their roofs as soon as they can do it. And that's going to cost everyone else who is attached to the grid more money. So yeah, it's just a frustrating day to live where we live.
Okay, so back to the U.S., the Biden administration is working on climate-friendly alternatives for jet and shipping fuels. So this is part of all the initiatives that they're doing in the U.S. to reduce carbon emissions. The goal of the agency is to develop fuels with greenhouse gas emissions that are at least 85% lower than fossil-based sources by 2035. So a lot of the initiatives in the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., 2035 is one of those numbers. And then absolute net zero by 2050 are sort of what everybody's talking about. So, this is also for feedstocks for plastics and other products. So the program, dubbed the Clean Fuels and Products Shot, aims to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 650 million metric tons of carbon dioxide by 2050, according to the Energy Department. It's modeled after the department's Sunshot initiative, which began in 2011 and aimed to reduce the total cost of solar power by 75% by 2020. And that program hit their mark 3 years early.
Wow.
When the cost of utility solar reached 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So something to mention here, this is the right choice for business. Clean energy, it's better and cheaper. But it is important to note that it got that way in part by government support over the years. So I hadn't heard of this Sunshot program before, but governments around the world helped us get to this place where solar finally is really, really cheap. I know Germany had a lot of programs to encourage solar, because you always hear those figures like 30 years ago, a solar panel cost, $10 million or something for one solar panel. And then the price kept coming down. Well, it was because of initiatives like this in the US, in Germany, and other places in Europe that encouraged this to get started. And then once the ball got rolling, then,
the ball rolling, by the way, was China. They started manufacturing and they started dumping solar panels on the world market, and that put German companies out of business. But it's one of those things where, kind of glad they did, because the world's at stake here, the future of the planet. And that may be one of those things that just worked out well, even though it may not have been terribly fair. But yeah, they're still the prime manufacturer of solar modules and panels.
Yeah. And so stuff like jet fuel that, jets are going to be very difficult to replace in a clean energy economy. So if we can figure out a way to make jet fuels in a less carbon intensive way, they're talking about things like biomass. But
hydrogen.
there are ways to make fuels that have less carbon in them.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens. There's a lot of, I have a lot of doubt around that. And I know that the refinery that is literally a couple miles away from me is planning on getting to net zero and making jet fuels eco-friendly jet fuels or renewable jet fuels eventually. I wish they wouldn't. I wish they would go out of business so I wouldn't have to breathe their
Yeah.
toxic air.
I mean, battery-powered planes is the ideal. It's just going to take us a while to get there. Did you see the thing? I think it was on Engadget. They're trying out a thing for towing electric jets. Did you hear about this?
Yeah, I got distracted. Something came up and I didn't finish it. But what happened?
So the problem with an airplane is it's hard to get enough range. So they figured they could do like a cross-continent flight by putting up every 100 miles, another plane goes up and releases a cable and then pulls the other plane until its battery runs out. And then, it seems ridiculous, but this is where some of the research is going.
Yeah, I get a little nervous when my taxpayer money goes to research that is a little bit dubious. Hey, it's time for the tweet of the week. Yeah, Twitter, the new Truth Social. I will not be on Twitter tonight when Ron DeSantis and Elon Musk talk about how great white people are. I will make their stats go down. Anyway, from Dr. Jan Rosenow, electric vehicles are growing rapidly. How much oil will they save by 2025? That's a year and a half, my friend. It's ridiculous. We started this, and that was a 5-year target away in this podcast, and now we're talking about a year and a half. Answer, 2.5 million barrels per day, which is equivalent to about 2.5% of total oil demand. Now, what I found surprising in this is, what sectors the demand is coming from, the fallen demand is coming from. And you see cars on there on the illustration. You see light trucks, last mile delivery, buses, but it's 2- and 3-wheel transportation are the most. It's 1.1 million. That is the bulk of it will be. It just goes to show that, we talked about 2-wheel transportation electrifying. It's happening very fast and is projected to happen very fast. And that is actually going to displace a fair chunk of fuel from the oil industry and, barrels of oil on a daily basis. That is pretty significant. So, yeah, buses would be third, and I guess the cars will be around 887,000, 1.1 million barrels just from 2- and 3-wheel. And, maybe scooters too, but mostly it's in countries around the world where they use 2- and 3-wheel transportation is rapidly electrifying. So that's good to see and interesting. I'm sure it'll change as we go on in years, but the start of it will be very quick transformation.
So global oil demand, like somewhere roughly around 100 million barrels a day. So 2.5%, 2.5 million barrels. The math is nice and easy on this.
Yeah.
2.5 million barrels is 2.5% of the demand. So, then you're going from 100 million barrels down to 98 million, down to eventually 97, 96. And, we'll eventually.
And remember, as these things fall, it gets worse and worse. I mean, there might be a bit of a plateau, I've heard now, for oil, but it gets worse and worse for them. Once you start to feel the effects, tomorrow is worse than today, and next week is way worse than this week. So that's very interesting to see.
Yeah, you end up with a glut before you know it. Even 2.5 million barrels makes a serious dent. Okay, so this is an interesting story about electrical meters. So part of my project here at my house to put in an air source heat pump, I had to upgrade my electrical panel from 100 amps to 200 amps. And this is something that a lot of people are going to do eventually, especially if you can afford it. It was expensive. It was around $6,000. That included digging a new line from the back alley. So we don't have overhead power anymore. It now goes under the ground. So it won't be that expensive for everybody, but about, $6,000 Canadian for me to do that. Less in American money, and also with the Inflation Reduction Act, there are some incentives for that. But anyway, there's people looking at other ways to do it. So people need to put up solar panels, they need to plug in their electric cars at their homes, but not everybody, of course, can afford the $6,000 to do that. So there's a company called Connect DER that has a plug-and-play meter collar adapter. And this is sort of a simpler way of doing this, and I don't quite understand how it works, but instead of putting in a whole new 200 amp panel, it's a little addendum that goes onto your power meter, and then you can then connect that to your solar panels or connect it to an EV charger. It's basically a way of expanding the capability of your meter and expanding the capability of the electricity in your house.
I see. So a lot of people have to have new electrical panels put in when they get solar because there's just not enough room for everything. I had enough room. They had to, it was kind of tricky, but they did it and didn't do a very good job of it, I might add, because of my recent issues with that panel getting hot, but they fixed it. Another company fixed it. Yeah, that's interesting because you won't have to go in the house to the solar panel. You go right to the meter. I get it now. I think I understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
and, our panel was fine until we wanted to do the heat pump, until we wanted to do the induction cooktop. Oh, and by the way, the induction cooktop finally arrived.
Oh.
I picked it up yesterday, so we'll be installing that.
You've got so much content for the show, Brian. Everything, it's very expensive content, but it's content.
Yes. I'm doing all this just so I have something to talk about on the show. But, yeah, but the only reason it worked up till now was we didn't have central air conditioning until now. Like if we had had central air conditioning, we would have had to do this sooner because that takes up quite a bit of space on your panel.
Yeah, a couple of slots there. Very interesting stuff. Yeah, I look forward to all of your upgrades, including your induction cooktop.
And I wanted to mention that these collars, so if any of our listeners are in the U.S. and they're looking to do these kind of upgrades, but you don't want to spend a few $1,000s to do the 200 amp service, these collars are available already in some places. So I'm looking at the list here: Vermont, New York, Florida, Ohio, Nebraska, Kentucky, West Virginia, Colorado. So if this is something you're interested in,
Kentucky,
you can see, you can see if it's available. And there's maybe not everywhere in Kentucky, but there's a specific, utility mentioned here.
The good
so
part
everybody
of
will have to look into this on their own, but it also has to be approved by the utility. So the utility has to look at these things and approve it, and it's got to become part of their standard. So not available everywhere, maybe eventually, but if it's something you're interested in, check with, so Connect DER is the company, and check with them or your local utility to see if you can do this.
Well, the show's getting long on the tooth, so we better get going here. Ukraine is using renewables to cope with that jackass Vladimir Putin. Go ahead, poison me, Putin, I dare you. From the Washington Post, one water company was able to keep its pumps going because its field of solar panels that it already had installed as an environmentally friendly measure to the war, before the war, rather, they were able to keep the pump going. So it's one example. But Brian, Ukraine as a whole wasn't terribly environmental. They weren't really getting the renewables going. They have a small amount of renewables. And now they're thinking renewables are a good thing because they're reliable. Yeah. People say renewables aren't reliable. We'll tell that when you live next door to Russia and they start throwing bombs your way and missiles. Renewables actually turn out to be quite reliable. I mean, they do have nuclear, obviously, and that is a big part of their power grid mix. So a growing number of Ukrainian hospitals, schools, police stations, and other critical buildings are racing to install solar panels ahead of what many expect to be another hard winter, although last winter was pretty manageable. But it is difficult not to have heat and light and everything else because they're kind of, like where we live, the days get a bit darker in the wintertime because of the northern latitude. Ukrainian doctors, teachers, and others have discovered that efforts to boost sustainability can also improve security by making it harder to knock power offline. Ukraine generated 11% of its electricity from renewable sources in 2020, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, although more than half of electricity, like I said, came from nuclear power plants. So advocates of renewables want solar power to be a sizable chunk of the new capacity. And although solar panels can't easily rival the power generation of nuclear, proponents say they are cheaper, faster to install, and more useful as a quick solution to Ukraine's immediate energy and security needs than nuclear power would be, which can take years to build and install. So they are talking about small modular nuclear in the future, but the government is working on coming back after this stupid thing is over, and they're going to have lots of renewables when that happens. So it's a good news story, I guess.
Yeah. And it can be put up quickly. It's by its nature decentralized. So it's, instead of just knocking out one nuclear power plant, it's decentralized. It reminds me a bit of Puerto Rico, which has been doing a lot of this too. Puerto Rico, of course, a lot of like hurricanes and stuff have been knocking out the power in Puerto Rico for years. And the solution is more solar and more batteries. And, it's, vastly improving the grid there. And, it's making them able to withstand those kind of storms better.
And they're encouraging people to donate, NGOs and whatnot to help get more money fueled in to help them through the next winter by getting solar. There's a picture in the Washington Post story, and it's in the basement. It looks like it's got a bank of chemical batteries, like lead acid batteries.
Yeah, like car batteries.
Yeah, all sort of linked together, and they're using that. So interesting. Anyway. Time for the lightning round.
The lightning round is a fast-paced look at the latest headlines in climate, clean energy, and transportation.
New York City is sinking, Brian, due to the weight of its skyscrapers. Not its EVs, it's skyscrapers. This is not good news for a city worried about rising oceans from climate change. So now they've got a new problem. Not only is the ocean going up, but New York City is going down. Not funny, James. Stop laughing. This April, for the first time, Portugal produced the majority of its electricity from wind and solar. The think tank Rethink X says Germany can reach 100% clean energy for less than what it's spending on fossil fuels. So all the money that fossil fuels are more expensive in Europe because they're harder to get than what we're used to in North America. Like gas has traditionally been, say, twice as much in Europe as it has been in the United States, for example. So just going to renewables can cost the same as just keeping on fossil fuels, is what they're saying. So electricity, they say, can get to net zero by 2030 for less than 1% of GDP. That is Germany, which I talked about last week as well.
Pocket change.
Oh, the CS fast fact. From Scientific American, nearly 80% of the CO2 emissions from burning coal, gas, and oil have been released since 1970.
That's shocking.
We think of, the industrial age started it. It did, but most of it has happened since you and I were toddlers, or at least we fellows, wrapped up in toques and snowsuits and whatnot. I said whatnot twice. I don't use the word whatnot. I think I'm getting old. California grid operator California ISO signs off on $7.3 billion for 43, get this, power lines. Not solar farms, not wind farms, but the actual lines to make them work. So that is a big part of what we have to do to, decarbonize the electricity grids, is to build more power lines. And that's always an issue because people don't want it in their backyards. And I empathize with that, but it has to be done one way or another. So they're going to be adding 17 gigawatts of solar. That is 17 nuclear power plants worth of solar when solar is at its peak during the midday, capable of that. And 8 gigawatts of wind, 1 gigawatt of geothermal, and battery storage projects as well. So geothermal is always a small part of the mix, but it's important because it is a base load, I guess. But yeah, it's just not always working out that great. Between September 2022 and September 2023 alone, California will have added 4.3 gigawatts of solar storage, energy storage, and 3.2 8 gigawatts of solar, 1.2 gigawatts worth of hydro based on their snowpack because of all the snow that happened. So they've got that hydro built up. That's enough for 70% of California's summer peak load and 34% of the peak load for the rest of the year. 4 times, this is the interesting thing, is 4 times the peak discharge of the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant in 1 year, because they are paying a lot of money to keep the Diablo reactor online for a longer period of time.
Yeah, and maybe not worth it.
Another CES fast fact from the BBC, 60% of Norway's buildings are fitted with a heat pump. That is followed closely by Sweden at 43% and Finland at 41%. Germany, the figure is only 4% and the UK is just 1%. So UK has a great opportunity because they have the climate that works perfectly well with a heat pump, don't they?
Yes, and they have some programs and they are making progress. I'm surprised it's still only 1%, but that's definitely going to go up.
And you are going, when are you going to the UK? It's coming up very quick, isn't it?
June 1st. So we have a regular episode next week. And then after that, we might take a week off as I'm in traveling in the UK.
You guys can put up with that, right? It's that time of the year. We need a week off to regenerate our batteries, as it were. Another CES fast fact for you. Only 2% of the U.S.'s electricians are women. 2%, Brian. And finally this week, the world is rapidly building the manufacturing base of 5 key technologies needed to reach net zero by 2050. Manufacturing capacity year on year grew for batteries 72%. And for solar, 39%, electrolyzers that are used in hydrogen production, 26%, and heat pumps are up 13%. This is manufacturing capacity. This is not sales. This is the manufacturing capacity for batteries. That's a huge jump at 72%. Brian, that is our show for this week. I just want to remind everyone before we go to take the time to contact us. Do it now. Don't wait. cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. Bunch more ways in your show notes to contact us, including online voicemail, on Twitter, and other ways to get a hold of us. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for special features and visual representations of us. And check out the Clean Energy Store, which is thriving. We hope to have the hats back very soon. They are gone for now, but they'll be back. You people have been buying them. Thank you. And if you're new to the show, remember to subscribe on your podcast app to get new episodes delivered every week, except for the 1 week that Brian might be putting his feet up in Wales, but we'll have a podcast from Wales, so that should be great.
Yeah, and we have a special treat to end the show. This is something we don't do very often, maybe once a year or so, but it's sometimes fun to end the show on a song. So that's what we're going to do this week. I was driving around in my car and I was listening to the new album from M. Greiner. It's called Business and Pleasure. And M is a friend of the show. We got to know her because we licensed one of her songs for the movie that James and I did. And I know her also through our mutual friend Patrick in Winnipeg. But I was listening to this song. One of them's called Summertime off her new album. And the sun was shining, the sky was blue. And I just thought, this is such a great summertime song. And we had such a long and brutal winter. It, might be time to enjoy some of this summertime. So I asked her if we could throw this song on the end of the podcast. She said yes. Also, a quick plug. I want to plug the new Def Leppard album.
What? What? Have you had a stroke? What? Huh?
Did you know that M. Greiner is on the new Def Leppard album?
I did. No. What an odd combination.
So M. Greiner, she's a fantastic Canadian singer-songwriter. I've been following her career since the beginning. She's just amazing. Many years ago, she did a cover version of Pour Some Sugar on Me, the Def Leppard song, their big classic hit song. And this is so fun, but Def Leppard eventually heard the song, really liked it, and their new album is called Drastic Symphonies, and they wanted to reimagine some of their songs for a symphony orchestra, and they liked M's version so much, they thought, hey, let's call M, and we'll do it with her on this album with a symphony orchestra. We're not going to play that, but you can find that on YouTube, Def Leppard with M. Greiner and Pour Some Sugar on Me. Her version is totally amazing, but we're going to listen to something from her new album, Business and Pleasure. I thought it'd be fun to give her a plug here on the show, and let's enjoy the summertime.
See you next week.
See you next week.
Love went cold in September. Didn't even know my name. I was a up and over, and our Mackinac sailed away. Summer came quick to my heart, and now it's summertime every day. We can put the bad times out of our heads. Oh, yes, we can. Great Lake loving, everybody holding hands in the summertime. Ooh, in the summertime.